Hello, everyone. Welcome to Midweek Gaming. A lot of bad news been coming out the last few weeks. We talk about some good news. So we all know Stop Killing Games, right? Or at least I hope you all do. For those who don't, it's a movement that was started about a year or two back, kind of resulted of the whole Crew 2 going offline, and this is kind of the after effects of Ubisoft's mess up. So I guess for once they did something good, unintentionally. I'm sure they're still kicking themselves over it. Regardless, the movement Stop Killing Games came out of that. And a lot of stuff's been happening. There's been some fights in legal battle and all that kind of stuff. And the movement's actually making progress. Not so much in Europe, last I checked, but definitely in California. California actually has a bill that they're passing on this, and it's actually doing pretty well. It's already won like three of the God knows how many legal checks and triple checks it has to go through for the House. So, yeah, let's talk about it because good stuff has been happening. Just a tangent side note. Well, not a side note, but a disclaimer going into it. My legalese ain't that great, so if I mess things up and you're a lawyer, forgive me. I will try my best to interpret, but also, second thing, there has been an addendum which we'll cover later.
Our ignorance isn't towards legal nations. We are only of gamers.
I mean, in fairness, I know that legally you can't use ignorance as a plea on legal terms, but in this case, cut me a little slack. I will attempt to interpret as best as I can, but my legalese, especially in the US system, is not the best. I from the US, but I grew up in Canada, so my knowledge of the US legal system is a bit lacking more than it should be. So you'll forgive me if I'm a bit out of it when it comes to knowing some terminology that the US viewers might be like, how do you not know that? But I don't know, let's be honest. A lot of US viewers probably don't even know the legal system there. Who would? So, anyways, moving on. So, this addresses a specific bill known as AB 1921, the Stop Killing Games Act, which I'm told actually, when you actually look at the bill and actually look at how it is actually pronounced, the Protect Our Games Act, it actually, fun fact, is called the POG Act, which I just, side note, someone point that out to me and I just found that hilarious. Not money, but just come on. We got the POG Act. That's the Gamers Act. Come on. The Gamer Act is known as the POG Act. Anyways. That joke's aside. So, anyways, the bill is actually going through, and it's actually been doing pretty well. It actually just recently passed the checking. There's like a few committees here. It actually just passed the Appropriations Committee, which is a very fiscal type of committee that basically sits there and says, okay, if this bill passes, what are the ramifications financially? Like, what's it going to cost the taxpayers? What's it going to cost the state, the government, da 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 da. Ultimately, with a slight amendment, they did end up passing it, though. So, the money people said, it's okay. And of course, the consumer rights people at the very beginning also said it was okay, and the Judiciary Committee also said it was okay. So both the legal and rights people are also like, it's good. So yay, great, right? Yeah, actually, this is actually the first of, however, a long string of things, which will very likely bleed over to the rest of the year. If this does get passed, it actually won't even take effect till January 20 something, or 1st, or something like that. January of 2027, effectively. Just because of how long it'll have to drag out through the courts if it works. Because it has to go through the House, which it is currently going through, and it's pretty much going through there pretty well. And then it'll have to go through the Senate, where it has to repeat the whole process again. Fiscal, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Which, I mean, it'll probably go faster, mostly because it's a double check kind of thing, you know. It's already been approved once, probably will be approved again. That all said, it would be bereft of me not to mention that the ESA, the Entertainment Software Association, TLDR, the lobby group of the American publisher, Western publisher, is very much against this bill, and they have been very vocal about that. Hasn't really helped them, but hey, for the sake of brevity, let's go over their arguments. So they released what is effectively a floor alert. TLDR, we pay you, so don't let this go through. And it is basically just a bunch of arguments that the ESA has thrown together as to why the bill is bad. I won't go over the whole thing. All of this will be down in the description, including the legal websites, as well as Stop Killing Games' own webpage, so if you want to go support them, go do that. But I will run over some of the more fun ones, because there is actually a photo I was trying to dig up prior to the show where they go through line by line. I think it was the founder, and he just disproves this stuff, and none of this is new, and it's all Some of it is just complete nonsense. So, one of them is that, AB 1921, the bill's mandate, impossible legal and technical obligations, which is not impossible. It's not impossible to do this. Because, we're not asking for much here. All we're asking is that one of three things comes from this bill. First off, if a game basically is told that, hey, you're going offline, especially one of, just in general, goes offline, give a 60 to 90 day notice. I think it was 60 days, might be wrong. And, let people know. And
Give people
two,
notice.
yeah, basically give people a written notice that their game is going offline, which is nice, but that's not what the meat and potatoes is, so let's just move on. Two, when that happens, you have one of really two options. Either A, make the game in some state playable, so some post-life support effectively, so kind of like what Destiny does, perhaps the best comparison I can kind of use for this off the top of my head at the moment, where, yeah, the game's not supported, there's no further updates, but they're keeping the servers up, or heck, you could argue TF2 is another good example of these kinds of things, where, yeah, let's be honest, Valve has basically abandoned that long ago, but they're still keeping the servers up, and the community can still build stuff and do stuff in that game, so that's a good example of kind of option A. And barring option A, if that is impossible for financial, technical, or whatever reasons, then option B is presented. Option B is basically just full refund of the purchase price. Because remember, this is them saying, hey, we sold you this, now give it back. Which technically is a breach of technically a buyer-seller contract when you think about it. So yeah, it's basically stopping them from saying, okay, we sold you something, now we're just taking it offline, bye-bye, we're taking your money and leaving. Which, again, goes back to the whole Crew 2 fiasco, which, they sold the crew, and they shut down the crew, and then they refused to basically give any end-life support, despite people wanting it, and they didn't give the money back either, so they just kind of took the money and ran. So this law is effectively to prevent that. Granted, there are some addendums, which is where we have to start getting into the revisions that this bill has gone under, right? Now, Stop Killing Games, to their credit, has always said that this bill has never intended to be retroactive. As I've been mentioning throughout this video piece, it is supposed to only take effect after its passing, if it gets passed, as of January, number provided, I can't remember, of 2027. And any game published or released after the fact, or re-released after the fact, would be subject to these terms and conditions. That was not always the case, however, technically in the fine print. Technically in the fine print, it was just that any game that was available for purchase as of the actual date, meaning that technically any legacy games that are still available for purchase technically could fall under this banner. Technically? But that has been, like I said, broadened down in scope, and it's actually been revised to specifically say digital games first available for purchase or re-released for purchase on January 1st. That's the number. January 1st, 2027. So, like I said, this very much narrows the scope to actually a specific type of game, those that were released on the date or thereafter, or who were re-released thereafter. So a good example for this would be what Nintendo does, for example, where they re-release games for purchase, years down the line. So, I don't know. Let's say the Mega Man game that I got a few months back for Star Force. Star Force? Yeah, it was. Getting hung up on specific details. Regardless. Yeah, Star Force. I was right. Weird detail to get hung up on, but... So that game came out way back in, like, the mid-2010s, early 2010s, let's say. That game series for DS. But only a few months back, they re-released it for Switch 2, or Switch in general. Switch in general, I should say. That would count as a re-release intended for purchase, and had this law already been in effect, then if it had been in effect in, say, 2018, then this law would have applied to that Switch port. So that's basically what's happening here. Any game that's officially made for release or re-released as of the time of this bill will then take it into effect, so legacy games are out of this thing officially, which again has always really been the point. So it's unfortunate that they couldn't get a more broader view, but hey, that was the original mission anyway, so it's not a loss ultimately. If you're hoping for a more holistic view of the thing and the more completest version or maximist view of the bill you could get, then yeah, I guess it's a loss. But in terms of practicality and actual like likelihood to succeed, this does ultimately mean a win, I would think, because you don't want a bill passing or getting near passing that's eventually shut down because somebody along the line says, ah, that's unfeasible, and they point out a very good reason, and the bill just dies. So yeah, that's kind of the most recent amendment to the bill, but so far everything has been going pretty well, all things considered. So yeah, that's kind of the notice of it. And like I said, the bill itself also mentions how they want to notify, posting the information publicly so people can actually see that it's ending.
Yeah,
Anyways,
being given proper notice on when something is discontinued does help people quite a bit.
yeah, like, for example, I could be petty here and mention Bungie. Fuck it, I will.
Too late.
You could say, too late, we're already there. You could mention something like, for example, Bungie did is also a example of what not to do, for example, where, I mean, well, no, technically they did still fall within bounds because they did give official notice beforehand. Not sure if it officially meets the deadline date of what, Stop Killing Games or Protect Our Games Act is, suggesting, but for a generalist sense, they did give some forenotice that the game was ending, even if it wasn't the best. But, eh. So, like I said, they're both a good and bad example, you could say. Another good example of what a re-release looks like is what Bethesda does, A few months back, they re-released Oblivion. Another good example of a game being re-released for the market that would, had the bill been passed, technically result in the law being carried over to that game. So yeah, that's kind of what we're looking at here. Like I said, though, the overall point of this piece is that things are going well, and arguably the ESA, while they're trying to disprove it, it's not really working. I mean, in the Reddit thread that Stop Killing Games has, they even themselves say that all of this stuff is just either completely nonsensical or stuff they've heard before 1,000 times and have disproven.
Right.
The claim of how, there's no legal precedent for people owning games. They straight up point out that, consumers effectively have no rights in this issue, so it's a very unbalanced position.
Yeah, because you don't have rights, so you're not allowed to have any rights to begin with.
Yeah, that's kind of the funny thing. They're
that's
arguing.
just how it works, right?
That's the funny part, right? You point out, and it sounds stupid the more you point out, because it is, right? They're basically arguing that how dare you argue for rights? You have no rights. Whereas the whole point of this is that's the problem. They're like, this makes new rights. Yeah, kinda. There aren't any. Again, continue support. That's not what the bill's asking for. The ESA argues, oh, you're arguing that you want us to continue support for games we're discontinued. No, we're not. We're just saying provide some kind of end-life policy for games. Again, Bungie, love them or hate them, are a good example of what to do in this regard. They left D1 and D2. They're still very playable to this day up on the internet, or up on the console, if you want to go there too. They ain't supporting it anymore. They ain't putting any D1 updates out for years now, and they won't be putting out any D2 updates for foreseeable future, which hurts to say aloud, but still.
How long?
Ever. But, point is, they're still up there, they're playable, you can still go and do all that stuff, barring the whole vaulting situation, which is all the well we won't get into. But at least in the case of D1, everything from start to finish is still there, you can still play it all like it first came out. That's kind of the point here, right? You don't want to continue support, just provide some avenue to keep it going, even if you're not the one supporting it. And if not, just give a refund, which I'm sure the word refund causes a bunch of...
Refund is a very big word.
We don't use those words. Those are very dirty words to say in executive game producer boardrooms.
Yeah, that's a
I'm sure it caused...
word.
Yeah, I'm sure it causes some EA accountant to break out in hives the minute they hear the word. But regardless, that's kind of the whole point of it, like I said. Things are going well. Much better than I heard, like I said, in the EU, where I think it's kind of stalled out last I heard. Didn't really go too far. So yeah, Great to see it going through in California, because if it does, that'll set a precedent not only for California, but the broader games industry as a whole and the US as a whole. Why? Two things, really. A, fun fact, I actually learned this today, which I'm not surprised to learn, but is that California is one of the biggest economies in the world. Yeah, economies. And that's part of a sub-economy that is the US. So which
Take
is,
that as
doesn't,
as you will.
well, no, don't let that, you know, let that sink in. A sub-economy of a bigger economy is still nonetheless one of the biggest economies in the world, aside from things like India. So let that sink in. So it makes sense why the games companies are so very against this going through in California, because this would mean a lot of money having to be spent on their part, which they don't like. But or at the very least some money, which also they don't like.
Why would they?
Why would they, right? Like I said, probably causes some gaming accountant to break out in hives the minute they hear the word refund. But anyways. So, like I said, that would set a precedent for the rest of the world because, again, it's a massive economy. They're going to have to accommodate for that. Also, it would set a precedent for the rest of the US, which is also what the politician who's backing this, a fellow by the name of checking. What is his name? He's a Democrat, I know that much. Which I'm sure some people are sitting there going, oh, of course he is. Oops. I'm into author. Whoopsies, that's not what I want. Wrong one. I've got like two legal sites I got pulled up here, and one mentions who is behind it. I think it's this one. There we go. Ah, here we go. Fellow by the name of Chris Ward. So anyways, he's the one who's authoring the bill. Which, as he himself points out, would be a precedent for the rest of the US, because if California does it, well, then that sets a precedent for the rest of the US, because then you get into the legal discussion of, well, if one state does it, you might have to enforce it in other states, because, you know, the states are technically interconnected, even if they're... Well, not fair, but it's just that, yeah, like, I often like to argue against people, especially in other countries, who use the word United States, because it gives far more precedent to the states being more united than they are. In practice, let me be honest with you, what I do know about the states is that they're all run like their own little fiefdoms. They all have their own laws, they all have their own method of doing things, and they are all very much, in some cases, against each other at times. We had a whole civil war about it. I don't know if you heard about it. But anyways, the states are very much divided, yet united on things. So when it comes to laws, that does tend to, while not necessarily force laws to become official in other parts of the country, it definitely puts pressure on other states to kind of follow suit to keep up with things that are more liked by the people. A good example might be the weed law, for example. Happened here, happened there, happened here, and eventually more people started liking it, so it got pushed in other states, and, you know, domino effect across the states. That's kind of the hope here in California. It gets passed in California, maybe tomorrow it gets passed in, I don't know, New York, you know, stuff like that. And then it kind of dominoes across the states. So yeah, good thing all around if it gets passed, both for the US and just the world as a whole, because it's also very difficult to enforce policy on a state-by-state level. This is also another kind of thing you can get into in the weeds of it, where once the US does it in one state, you kind of have to do it across the entire US, because as far as the game companies are concerned, they kind of treat every country and every region like their own little dividends. Like the European market is handled differently, the North American market is handled differently, countries within the North American market are handled differently, but they don't go so far as to do it on a state level most of the time. So if one state tends to negate or tends to require something, it just kind of becomes a thing they do across all the states, because technically, if you sue them in the US, you could technically bring it to a court and say California and have that done. So it's just easier for them to treat the whole states as just one giant market that they kind of enforce globally. So anyways, that's a whole bunch of rambling that says that, yeah, if this does work in the US and specifically California, then this is just good all around, which is kind of obvious to say aloud, but still worth mentioning. But yeah, that kind of brings us to the end of this video, near 20-minute rant of how good the Stop Killing Games movement is, for us at least, not the ESA, which, I mean, screw the ESA. They really are just a lobby group in disguise. Well, they are not even in disguise, they're just a lobby group. So yeah, keep up with it, keep track of it. Like I said, all that's down in the description you want to support, and if you're in a resident of Cali, go support this bill. Push your senators, push your congressmen, tell them to let it go through, And yeah, we'll all, as a gaming community, be happier for it. So yeah, that's it for the show. Hope you all enjoyed. Unless you have any closing remarks, Justin.
No, no.
I guess the cat does.
Yeah,
But
the cat does.
the cat does. I don't know what it was because I don't speak feline. But let's just say it was an affirmation to what I said. So yeah, that's the show, everyone. Hope you all enjoyed. Have a good night, everybody. Bye bye.
Have a good one.